In the winter of 1809, something extraordinary was happening in the underground chambers beneath the streets of London. While Napoleon's Grand Army marched across Europe, seemingly unstoppable on the battlefield, British intelligence officers were orchestrating a different kind of warfare, one that would prove far more devastating than any military campaign. They were preparing to flood France with millions of pounds worth of counterfeit currency, a weapon that would strike at the very heart of Napoleon's empire and ultimately contribute to his downfall. This is the story of how Britain waged economic warfare through one of history's most ambitious forgery operations, a tale of espionage, financial manipulation, and the power of money as a weapon of war. To understand how Britain came to wage financial warfare against Napoleon, we must first understand the world of the early 19th century. By 1805, Napoleon Bonaparte had crowned himself Emperor of France and dominated continental Europe. His armies had crushed the Austrians at Austerlitz, humiliated the Prussians at Jena, and seemed poised to bring all of Europe under French control. Britain stood virtually alone against this continental colossus, protected by the English Channel and the Royal Navy, but unable to challenge Napoleon's land forces directly. The traditional methods of warfare, the clash of armies and the siege of fortresses, favored the French emperor, who had revolutionized military tactics and commanded the loyalty of the largest and most experienced army Europe had seen since the Romans. British strategists faced a seemingly impossible dilemma. They could not defeat Napoleon militarily on the continent, yet they could not allow him to consolidate his power unchallenged. It was in this context that members of the British government and intelligence services began to contemplate unconventional methods of warfare. They understood something fundamental about Napoleon's empire. For all its military might, it rested on fragile financial foundations. The constant wars required enormous expenditure. Napoleon needed to pay his soldiers, provision his armies, and maintain the administrative apparatus of his conquered territories. Money was the lifeblood of his empire, and if that blood could be poisoned, the empire itself might collapse from within. The idea of using counterfeit currency as a weapon of war was not entirely new, but never before had it been contemplated on such a massive scale. The concept was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its potential. If Britain could flood France with fake assignats and mandats, the paper currency that circulated throughout the French Empire, it could trigger hyperinflation, destroy confidence in the French monetary system, and create economic chaos that would undermine Napoleon's ability to wage war. The beauty of this strategy was that it required no armies, no battlefields, and no direct confrontation. The weapon would be delivered by smugglers, spies, and merchants, spreading through the economy like a slow poison until the entire financial system convulsed. The man often credited with conceiving this audacious plan was George Canning, the British Foreign Secretary, though the operation involved numerous officials from the Treasury, the Foreign Office, and British intelligence services. By 1809, these men had come to believe that economic warfare represented Britain's best hope of defeating Napoleon. They had observed how revolutionary France had already experienced severe monetary crises. During the 1790s, the revolutionary government had issued vast quantities of assignats, paper money backed by confiscated church lands. These had eventually become worthless through over-issuing and counterfeiting, contributing to economic chaos that weakened the revolutionary regime. Napoleon himself had stabilized the French currency after coming to power, introducing the gold franc and restoring confidence in French finances. Now, British strategists aimed to reverse that achievement and plunge France back into monetary chaos. The practical challenges of counterfeiting French currency on a massive scale were enormous. The British needed to create forgeries so perfect that they could circulate undetected within France for months or even years. This required obtaining genuine French currency notes to serve as models, recruiting master engravers and printers, acquiring the correct paper and inks, and establishing a distribution network that could smuggle millions of francs worth of fake notes into France without detection. The operation would need to be conducted in absolute secrecy, for if Napoleon learned of it, he could simply change the design of French currency, rendering all the British forgeries worthless overnight. British agents scoured Europe for examples of French currency, purchasing genuine notes from merchants, travelers, cursors, and prisoners of war. These authentic notes were delivered to master engravers in London who studied every detail, every flourish of the hand-engraved designs, every watermark and security feature. The engravers who undertook this work were among the finest craftsmen in Britain. Men whose skill in reproducing intricate designs was unmatched. They worked in secure facilities, often not knowing the true purpose of their labor, told only that they were working on sensitive government documents. The paper presented a particular challenge. French currency was printed on special paper with distinctive watermarks and a unique texture. British agents had to locate suppliers who could produce paper that matched these characteristics precisely. By 1810, the counterfeit operation was in full production. Printing presses hidden in London and other British cities were churning out fake French currency by the thousands of pounds sterling equivalent. The notes were extraordinarily convincing, virtually indistinguishable from genuine French currency even upon close inspection. British intelligence had succeeded in creating what amounted to a weapons factory, except the weapons being produced were pieces of paper that would wage war through economic disruption rather than physical destruction. The scale of the operation was unprecedented. Historians estimate that between 1809 and 1813, British forgers produced counterfeit French currency worth tens of millions of francs, a sum that represented a significant fraction of the total French money supply. Getting the counterfeit notes into France required a sophisticated smuggling network. Britain had been blockading French ports since 1806, part of the economic warfare strategy that Napoleon had countered with his continental system, which attempted to exclude British goods from Europe. But this network of blockades and counter-blockades had created a thriving smuggling trade. Goods flowed between Britain and the continent through neutral ports, particularly in northern Germany and the Baltic, and through Spain and Portugal, where British forces were fighting the Peninsular War. British agents recruited smugglers, merchants, and sympathetic locals to carry the counterfeit currency into France. Some notes were smuggled in commercial cargo, hidden among legitimate goods. Others were carried by individual agents who crossed borders on foot or by small boat. In Spain and Portugal, British military forces directly introduced counterfeit currency into circulation, using it to pay local suppliers and informants. The counterfeit notes began circulating in France in significant quantities by 1810, and their impact was soon felt. French authorities started receiving reports of suspicious currency appearing in border regions and major commercial centers. Shopkeepers and merchants, always wary of being stuck with worthless paper, began scrutinizing currency more carefully, which slowed commercial transactions. The mere suspicion that counterfeit notes were in circulation began to undermine confidence in paper money. People who had previously been willing to accept paper currency now demanded payment in gold or silver coin, which were in short supply. This forced the French government to confront a monetary crisis at the worst possible time, just as Napoleon was preparing for his fateful invasion of Russia. Napoleon's government responded as aggressively as it could. Police launched investigations to track down the sources of the counterfeit currency. Authorities issued warnings about fake notes and provided guidance on how to detect them. In some cases, the French government had to withdraw entire series of currency notes from circulation and issue replacements, a costly and disruptive process. But these measures could not keep pace with the flood of fake currency pouring into France from multiple directions. For every counterfeit note the authorities detected and removed from circulation, dozens more were being introduced. The psychological impact was perhaps even more damaging than the direct economic effect. When citizens lose confidence in their currency, they begin to hoard goods, refuse paper money, and engage in barter, all of which disrupts the normal functioning of an economy. The economic impact of the counterfeit currency operation compounded other financial pressures that Napoleon's empire was experiencing. The continental system. Napoleon's attempt to exclude British goods from Europe and strangle British trade was proving difficult to enforce and was creating shortages of colonial goods like sugar, coffee, and cotton that Europeans had become accustomed to. The constant wars required ever-increasing taxation, which made Napoleon unpopular with the very populations he had conquered. Now, the counterfeit currency crisis added inflation and monetary instability to these burdens. Soldiers began to complain that their pay was worth less. Government contractors demanded payment in gold rather than paper. The financial apparatus that sustained Napoleon's armies and administration began to strain under these multiple pressures. By 1812, as Napoleon assembled the largest army Europe had ever seen for his invasion of Russia, the French economy was already showing signs of serious strain. The counterfeit currency in circulation had contributed to inflation, which eroded the purchasing power of French money. This made it more expensive for Napoleon to provision his Grande Armée, as suppliers demanded more currency for the same goods, suspecting that the money they received might be worth less tomorrow than today. The disastrous Russian campaign of 1812, which destroyed much of Napoleon's army and shattered the myth of his invincibility, was made worse by these underlying economic weaknesses. Napoleon had entered Russia with financial problems at home, and he returned to find those problems had multiplied. The years 1813 and 1814 saw the economic pressure on France intensify dramatically. The coalition armies of Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Britain closed in on France from all sides. Napoleon performed brilliantly with diminished forces, winning several battles against the odds. But he could no longer sustain the financial burden of total war. The French economy was exhausted. The counterfeit currency continued to circulate, contributing to a loss of faith in French government finances. When Napoleon needed to raise new armies, equip them, and pay them, he found the financial resources simply were not there. Conscripts deserted because their pay was worthless. Suppliers refused to provide goods on credit to a government they no longer trusted. The financial system that had enabled Napoleon to dominate Europe for over a decade was collapsing. After Napoleon's first abdication in 1814 and his dramatic return during the 100 Days in 1815, the financial exhaustion of France played a crucial role in his final defeat. When Napoleon returned from exile in Elba and marched on Paris, he found a country financially prostrate. He could raise armies through his personal magnetism and the loyalty of veterans, but he could not pay them adequately or supply them properly. The campaign that ended at Waterloo was fought by a French army that was, in many respects, held together by Napoleon's personality rather than by a functioning military financial system. When he finally fell, one of the many factors that contributed to his defeat was the economic warfare that Britain had waged so effectively through counterfeit currency and commercial blockade. The British counterfeit currency operation against Napoleon remains one of history's most successful examples of economic warfare. It demonstrated that money could be weaponized as effectively as gunpowder, that financial systems could be targeted with the same strategic thinking applied to military campaigns, and that economic disruption could contribute materially to the defeat of even the most powerful military force. The operation was never officially acknowledged by the British government during or immediately after the Napoleonic Wars. It remained a closely guarded secret, known only to the small circle of officials and agents who had orchestrated it. But the evidence of its existence and its impact gradually emerged through historical research, diplomatic correspondence, and the memoirs of participants. The ethical implications of the counterfeit currency operation were complex and remain debated by historians. On one hand, counterfeiting currency was, and is, considered a criminal act under the laws of most nations. The British government was engaged in what was essentially state-sponsored fraud on a massive scale. The counterfeit notes harmed ordinary French citizens who found themselves holding worthless paper, not just Napoleon's government. Merchants who accepted fake notes in good faith suffered losses. The monetary chaos contributed to economic hardship for millions of people. On the other hand, Britain was fighting for its survival against a conquering empire that threatened to dominate all of Europe. The counterfeit operation was one weapon in a total war, and by modern standards, it was far more humane than many alternatives. It did not kill civilians directly, though the economic disruption it caused certainly contributed to hardship. In the brutal calculus of war, it was a relatively bloodless method of weakening an enemy. The legacy of Britain's financial warfare against Napoleon extends far beyond the Napoleonic Wars themselves. The operation established precedents and principles that would be studied by military planners, intelligence services, and financial authorities for generations. During the First World War, both sides engaged in various forms of economic warfare, including counterfeiting and financial manipulation. In the Second World War, Nazi Germany operated a massive counterfeit operation targeting British currency, producing fake pound notes in concentration camps in a scheme known as Operation Bernhard. The British, drawing on their Napoleonic experience, mounted defensive measures and counter-operations. In the modern era, economic sanctions, financial restrictions, and cyber attacks on banking systems represent the evolution of the same principle. That economic disruption can be a powerful weapon in international conflict. The story of how Britain financially destroyed Napoleon through counterfeit currency is ultimately a story about the nature of power and the foundations of empire. Napoleon had built his empire on military genius, administrative efficiency, and the loyalty of his soldiers, but all of these rested on economic foundations. Money paid the soldiers, provisioned the armies, and sustained the bureaucracy. When those economic foundations were undermined through inflation, counterfeiting, and loss of confidence in currency, the entire structure became vulnerable. Britain, unable to match France on the battlefield, found a way to strike at these foundations, waging war in the realm of finance rather than on the field of honor. The counterfeit currency operation was not the sole cause of Napoleon's defeat, but it was a significant contributing factor, one that has often been overlooked in favor of more dramatic military narratives. As we look back on this remarkable episode more than 2 centuries later, we can see how it changed the nature of warfare itself. The idea that nations could be defeated through economic means as well as military force, that currency could be weaponized, and that financial systems were legitimate targets in wartime, all of these concepts emerged from Britain's campaign against Napoleon. The counterfeit operation demonstrated that in modern warfare, victory might not go to the side with the most soldiers or the best generals, but to the side that could mobilize all its resources, including its financial and economic power, most effectively.